Hi everyone, we're just getting all set up. Hi everyone, welcome to the breathwork panel. Hi there, how are you?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay.
Awesome. Let's see, let's just get Samuel on here as well. Okay, there we go. Hi, how are you both doing?
Hello, everybody.
Just great. Hello.
Awesome. Okay, let's see, let's just wait for a few more people to join. Okay. All right, we are all set up. Thank you everyone for being here today. Today we're on a breathwork panel, and we are joined here today by Dr. Jack Feldman and then also Samuel Whiting to talk us through some breathing techniques and specifically how that's related to stress reduction. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the two of them, and then we'll jump into it. Okay. So Samuel Whiting is a leader in the field of human potential and has worked with and been inspired by revered mentors, coaches, and scientists like Wim Hof, Dr. Jack Feldman, and Dr. Andrew Huberman. Sam's experience has evolved from his background in elite alpine ski racing, power yoga, and adventure challenges. The focus of his work is empowering others to build awareness through self-directed and actionable tools like breathing practice and cold exposure to improve metabolic efficiency, cultivate mental fortitude, and build a healthy, adaptive relationship to stress. Sam is a certified Wim Hof Method Instructor and leads daily sessions, trainings, and programs with Our Breath Collective and consults with many others. Thanks so much for being here.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me and for putting on this live session. Welcome to everybody who's tuning in, and excited to explore today with you all.
Very nice. Okay, and then I can just introduce Dr. Jack Feldman as well. So Dr. Jack Feldman is a distinguished professor of neurobiology at UCLA. He's a renowned neurobiologist who revolutionized our understanding of how breathing movements are generated and controlled by the nervous system. He discovered two oscillators that generate and regulate the inspiratory and expiratory phases of normal breathing and sighs. His seminal studies explain how molecules and circuits modulate breathing associated with different behavioral states, including emotion. He has received numerous prizes, including the Hodgkin-Huxley-Katz Prize from the Physiological Society, and more. Thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to this session.
Awesome. Great. So just to start us all off, I wanted to just talk briefly about how you both are connected with InsideTracker and anything that you've learned through InsideTracker about your health.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having us. It's been a pleasure connecting with InsideTracker. I personally found you this summer and with Kaylee, who is the community manager. And I got interested in my own personal journey in health and wellness from my background in elite sports to then the work that I'm doing as a leader in health and wellness, and from working with my primary care physician to then have something like InsideTracker that's so easily accessible to really take a look under the hood. I went and just within a day was able to get a full blood panel, and the interactive experience with InsideTracker and the integrated app, so that there's really this fluid and actionable steps around how you can understand what's going on with your own health and wellness. So it's been informative and really getting a snapshot as to where I'm at or where you're at, and to be able to take actionable steps, whether it be nutritionally or with physical activity, so that you can continue to reach and achieve your health and wellness goals. And so amidst that, there's so much to learn and explore, and really that's what I love to come from, is the curious mind of how we can continue to grow and develop. And working with your team and the science and the integrated app has been a really complementary process to what I've felt personally in achieving my goals and experiencing health and wellness. So
Awesome. Yeah, and I think the InsideTracker provides a good way to be able to kind of quantify some of those health metrics too. So glad to see that you've enjoyed that experience too.
absolutely. And more to come. I have another test coming soon, so excited to share about all that. And really, that's where this journey all began. As in my younger years, I was an elite alpine ski racer, and I was constantly immersed in training, whether it be cycling, physical, weightlifting, different sports that all are complementary in building strength and endurance, power and agility, so that you can kick out of the starting gate on the top of a mountain and be in this very dynamic sport that is skiing. And so through the years, as I then decided to retire, I went to other modalities that would serve me in continuing to feel strong and healthy. And yoga practice became something that I fell in love with. And really, the breathing is what drew me in. I loved the resonant ujjayi breathing in the yoga practice that I was involved in. I never thought that I would teach anything, to be honest. As I started to get into a daily practice, there was something about what the teachers or the leaders were doing in the room, and I felt very called to want to share my practice, because I was starting to have realizations about myself and learn about what's possible going beyond the confines of our minds. And as I started to receive mentorship and teach yoga, I, by chance, came across a guy named Wim Hof, who I had actually seen when I was a lot younger on Ripley's Believe It or Not. He was doing a Guinness World Record in a big chest of ice. And so when I when I revisited his work in my later years, it was like a homecoming, because there was snow and cold, just like in ski racing, and this theme of being in nature. Just like when I was a kid, I grew up running around in the trails and riding my bike in Western Massachusetts. And the breathing techniques that he was speaking to were very much calling my curiosity around, wow, how is it possible to do the things that Wim's doing? And so many biology books spoke to the autonomic nervous system as something that we can't consciously regulate. And that was something that he was on the forefront of looking to de-stem. And so as I started exploring those practices, I was drawn into one specific method of breathing, which is that of the Wim Hof method. And I really was captivated with Wim's pursuit in the science of making these practices accessible to the world and understood through underlying mechanism of physiology and biology. So as I started to practice and teach these breathing techniques, it led me down this rabbit hole of looking to understand mechanism further through the nervous system. And that's what drove me to discover Dr. Jack Feldman's work, as he is one of the leading neurobiologists in the field of breathing. And within that, I became curious to now consider that breath is a behavior. So at that, I'd love to open up the conversation to you, Jack, to share a little bit about where your work stems from, pun intended there, and for any inspiration that you would like to bring life to in this conversation.
Sure, thanks, Sam. I got interested in breathing sort of through a back door. I was a graduate student in physics, and I got interested in how the brain worked. And I had an advisor who was a famous physicist who was very nervous when I told him I was interested in how the brain worked, because he said it's too complicated. You can't really understand anything. And he said as a challenge to me, find something you think you can understand. And I did a lot of work, and I thought breathing would be straightforward to understand. It's an oscillator, which a physicist knows how to deal with. You can measure all the parameters, and it looked like an easy problem that I would solve in a couple of years and move on to other aspects of the nervous system that may be considered to be more complex. But it's turned out that breathing is an extremely rich behavior, and it's not simple. Breathing does a lot for us. It's important, of course, for maintaining life and getting in oxygen and expiring carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of metabolism, but it's doing much more. And in the past decade, I've become very interested in trying to understand how breathing can affect emotion and cognition. I accept the data going back thousands of years that it does, But as a scientist, I was interested in trying to understand by what mechanisms is this happening. And the people in my lab talked about this quite a bit. And my experimental model is rodents, because it allows us to explore things that we can't do in humans for ethical, moral, or technical reasons, but we're able to do under the appropriate ethical considerations in mice. And so we've been trying to develop a system to look at how breathing affects emotion in mice. And we've not published anything yet, but we have some good data that in fact we can study this effect in mice. That it, one of the concerns about the effects of breathing on emotion and stress is that it may just be a placebo effect. And we felt that if we could demonstrate this as a bona fide action in rodents, in mice, it can't be a placebo effect. And I think I can say with a certain degree of confidence, although we haven't published the data yet because we have to get to a certain level of surety, that it is an effect you see in mice. And at least my mice don't believe in the placebo effect. So it's real. And now we have the challenge in front of us of trying to understand what the mechanism is. I'll pass it back to you now, Sam, and I certainly will delve deeper as we go further into the discussion.
Absolutely. Something that's curious about these modern times, we often hear about stress and how people are stressed out, and we tend to then put a negative connotation to stress. And something in the work that I've been exploring with breathing and with cold exposure and delving into these layers of the nervous system, that breathing practice can be a way to build capacity and resiliency in stress. Just like when you get into an ice bath, you're consciously and deliberately entering yourself into acute stressors. And in doing so, we're building more capacity, or in my perspective, as I like to say, a healthy nervous system that responds well to stress. And so curious for your perspective or comments on stress itself and how we can learn how to leverage stress to build a healthy, robust nervous system for the maximum health and wellness and longevity within our own lives.
Maybe I can comment on that, Sam. I mean, stress is part of life. And I think that stress can be positive, but it's one of these physiological factors where if you have too much stress, it's unhealthy. And probably if you have too little stress, it's probably unhealthy because maybe you're not motivated to do anything. And one of the challenges that we all have is how to deal with our day-to-day stress. And in conditions where the stress gets overwhelming and begins to get pathological, are there pathways that we can use to help manage that stress better? And I've become convinced over the past 5 years from our own research and my reading and working with colleagues that breathing practice can complement any other mechanism that anyone is using to deal with stress. So exercise is good, maintaining your physiological function is good, but regardless, if you add a breathing practice on top of that, it seems to have benefit regardless of what else you're doing. So I really have drunk the Kool-Aid about breathing practice, that it can be extremely useful in everyone doing it. And it's easy to do, it's low cost, it's low risk. And when I speak to my friends and colleagues, I'm constantly encouraging them to give it a shot.
And that's the amazing thing about the breathing practice, is that you can do it anywhere. It's free, and you don't need to have any fancy gear or clothing to do it. Actually, in fact, we're all breathing right now. In a conversation that you and I had, Jack, when we were talking about how to engage with the breathing practice. Sometimes it can feel daunting when we're looking to try something new, or we want to make a positive change in our lives, that carving out an hour to go to the gym or half an hour to do a breathing practice can feel daunting and like already a failure. So as you said, we're already 90% of the way there because we're all already breathing. So that extra 10%.
And moreover, even if you're not engaged in a breathing practice, you still use breathing to help calm you down. You know, you talked about playing golf. When you're on the first tee and you're nervous, you take a few deep breaths and it calms it down. You may not hit it down the middle of the fairway, but you'll be more relaxed. Or when you need to talk to a large audience, or any situation where you're meeting your significant other's parents for the first time, you take a few deep breaths and it does relax you. And so we've all experienced that. And where I think breathing practice comes in is that if we do it systematically for a somewhat longer period of time, that it can have a much more penetrating effect on overall health than simply taking a few breaths here and there to deal with sort of an acute stressor. So I would encourage people to give it a shot. I think I've spoken to you about this, that it's a little bit like exercise, that we all know exercise is beneficial. And some people don't want to do it. They're intimidated by it. They don't have an exercise that they like. And what I tell them is, you don't have to go and run a marathon. Just find something that is comfortable. Just take a long walk. And as you get into it, you can find, exercises that maybe you like better than others. And I think it's the same way with breathing practice. I think there are things that everyone can do that are rather simple to explore the very basics of breathing practice. And then as they feel that it works for them, and there's some people who may not feel it works for them, but if they feel it works for them, then they might explore that they might want to try variations on a basic practice. But even a basic practice is going to be helpful, I believe, for most people.
Right. And that's the thing. There are so many different methods of breathing out there, whether it's Wim Hof method or rebirthing or Buteyko method, and that they all come from what I've enjoyed in learning about the nervous system in your work is working from the mechanism and the principles of breathing, that you ultimately can create your own breathing toolkit so that you can bring that with you wherever you go. And that instead of looking for the best method or the right method or the answer that's going to, open up the doorway to all our hopes and dreams, is that through exploring and getting curious about how you can create your own custom breathing practices is really where the art of practice can allow for something extraordinary in your own unique life. And what's really stood out to me in your work is for everybody to consider that breathing is a behavior, and to start looking at breath as a behavior and its interconnectedness to all of our states of being. Could you speak to breath as a behavior?
Absolutely. So we discovered this region in the brainstem, which is the part of the nervous system which is sort of above the neck, going up into the head. And there is a very small population of cells, a few thousand neurons, that are generating this rhythm of breathing. And we named it the pre-Butsuya complex. And we focused mostly on how this was producing the respiratory movements. But recently, as I said, we've become interested in how it's affecting other behaviors. And if I could take a minute or two, I can give sort of a course sort of overview as how we think this might be happening. So when we look at how the brain works, we have many different parts of the brain getting in information from all different sources. So when I'm talking to someone, I can hear their voice coming in through my ear, going into my auditory cortex. I can see them coming in through my eyes, into my visual system. I can, if I'm close enough, I might be able to smell them. And yet I don't see these as different fragments and different images. I see this as one coherent whole. And so one of the challenges in evolution was how the nervous system found a way to make these information coming in all these different paths in very different parts of the brains appear as a whole. And with neuroscientists, I think it's pretty accepted, is that the information is binded. And how does that happen? Well, one way is if you look in the brain, there are all sorts of oscillations of activity happening all the time. Some as fast as 100 oscillations per second, some only a few oscillations per second. And over the past decade, people have discovered that there are oscillations with the breathing cycle in the brain. And so these different oscillations are able to get precise timing. So when a signal comes into my ear and the signal comes into my eye, if it's occurring at a particular time in an oscillation, let's say at the peak of an oscillation, if it's coming into both places at the peak and then goes to a third place, my brain knows that they should be part of the same thing. Now, if these oscillations are playing a role in this binding process, then if you interrupt the oscillation in some way or change the oscillation in some way, it's going to change the way the brain is processing information. And we think that what's happening with breathing, which is the only one of these oscillations, everyone has straightforward control over the frequency and depth and pattern, that you can change this. So let me give you an example, a more extreme example. Consider someone who is depressed. We can imagine depression as activity in a circuit of neurons sort of going around and around and around. And what happens in the brain, when neurons are doing the same thing over and over again, their connections become stronger. And so as they become stronger, if it's in a positive aspect of the daily function, that's great. But if it's in a negative aspect like depression, it is very negative and it can be very hard to break out of. And it's a little bit, I describe it to people, it's like, suppose you walked around in a circle on soft ground. After a while, you start tracing out a rut, the rut gets deeper and deeper, and suddenly you're so deep in the rut, you can't get out. So how do you get out of this depression? Well, we know extraordinary means can be helpful for people who have what's called refractory depression. That is, drugs don't work, therapy doesn't work. But if we give a massive electric shock to the brain, it helps reset the circuits, because what you're doing is you're disrupting the activity. And when you disrupt activity, the neurons begin to weaken their connections. So now imagine, it's sort of like filling in this rut that you made walking around, and you can fill it up enough that you may be able to climb out of the rut. So these large electrical convulsions are very heroic. That can't be done by everyone. But breathing is almost certainly involved in this circuit. So now if I change my breathing pattern, it's going to disrupt this way the circuit is now circulating its activity. And as it disrupts it, it's going to relieve it. But we have to change our breathing pattern for an extended period of time, 10, 20, 30 minutes, and repeat it over days. But it can be very effective in doing that because it's disrupting this activity, which is becoming so ingrained, we can't break it out. So I think for a lot of the negative emotions, by changing the way the activity is propagating, by changing the breathing pattern, allows your brain to reconfigure itself in a more positive way. I hope that made sense.
So this is falling into that category of long-term potentiation and long-term depression, the rut that you're speaking to.
Those are the terms that neuroscientists use, yes.
So for anybody who may experience chronic anxiety or depression, that going into this direct link of breathing to the nervous system and being able to fluctuate frequency, playing around with different practices and protocols, it becomes that opportunity to pop yourself out of the rut and start to create new neural connections and change that perception and experience of emotion or the release of emotion. Oftentimes in some of the deeper breathing practices, like that could be up to an hour or 90 minutes, those tend to be very deep emotional type of releases. And at the same time, and that can be a lot for some people, that one approach that I've very much appreciated through the work that we do with our Breath Collective is to come from this minimum effective dose perspective, that we guide and lead 12 to 15 minute live sessions Monday through Friday on a live platform. And that we can, just by deliberately creating a space for 15 minutes and experimenting and playing around with some different breath protocols, that we are building a consistency in reinforcing, strengthening our breathing musculature and building a foundation for efficient breathing oscillation.
Yeah, I like to compare that too to also, so we know that when you're working out and you're trying to build muscles, you try to, progressively increase the amount of weight that you're putting on so that you can be able to build your muscles to be bigger and bigger. And I think it's really interesting to kind of compare that to how the breathing practice works as well. So it's kind of like working up to something and building resilience.
Absolutely. As a friend and colleague of ours, Dr. Andrew Huberman at Stanford said when we did a live session last year, was don't skip diaphragm day. Everyone goes to the gym and we work out certain muscles, but our primary breathing muscle, which is that partition between our thoracic and abdominal cavities, is the diaphragm. And that's our primary muscle for moving air. And it's often neglected. We have these goals of endurance or power and strength, but if we neglect our breathing muscles, we're almost missing the mark on being able to create more energy and to have more longevity in our lives. So within this perspective of breathing as a behavior, Jack, there's so many people that are walking around with their phones, being at desks, working on computers, different responsibilities through life. And there's even a new buzzword out there that they're calling email apnea, when we're sitting writing and we end up falling into this holding pattern of our breathing. But your research has showed that there's this oscillation of breath that has to happen in order for us to continue to regulate our state of being and to continue to allow our cells to respire and produce ATP, life-giving energy. And so could you speak to the art of a sigh, if you will, or the phenomena of sighing in humans and mammals, and some key characteristics within the inhalation and the exhalation at rest?
Sure. So our lungs are really amazing organs. We breathe in air, which has 20% oxygen. And the question is, how does the oxygen get into the bloodstream? Well, you have this single tube, your trachea, and it divides and divides and divides. And it divides so many times that there are 400 million end tubes from this one tube, 400 million. And they end in these tiny little spheres of tissue called alveoli. And they're about 1/100 of an inch in diameter. And every time you inhale, you expand your chest, these alveoli get a little bit bigger and they suck in air that has a little bit more oxygen. And at the same, and this air, this oxygen, now crosses the alveolar membrane into the capillaries in the lung where the blood is, oxygenating the blood. And therefore, when it leaves the lung, it's well oxygenated. And at the same time, the blood is dumping into the alveoli carbon dioxide, which is produced by normal metabolism, which you exhale. Now, one of the challenges that we have is our lungs, these alveoli are so small that they have a tendency to collapse. Now, they don't collapse all at once, but they're constantly, a few of them are collapsing. And when they collapse, they're like wet balloons. And if you ever try to inflate a wet balloon, you realize it's very hard. You can't just use a normal breath to blow it up. You got to really use a lot of extra pressure because the sides of the balloon, which now are collapsed, stick to each other. And so you got to pop it open. So nature solves that in mammals with these 400 million alveoli with taking a deep breath every couple of minutes. So humans, we sigh about 12 times an hour, about every 5 minutes. And I would say for those of you who may be skeptical about that is to lie down in a quiet place and just breathe naturally. And you'll notice about every 5 minutes or so, you take a deep breath and you can't stop it. You don't need to initiate it. It happens. And what that is doing, it's making sure your lungs restore all those alveoli that have collapsed. Now, we, working with colleagues at Stanford, Kevin Yackel, Mark Krasnow, and Peng Li, found the circuit in the brain stem that's responsible for producing every 5 minutes, or if you're a mouse, every 2 minutes, one of these big breaths. Now, we noticed that we sigh not only for this physiological sigh, but whenever we're stressed, whenever we're happy, you know, the sigh of lovers, the sighs when you're distressed. And the reason being is that the neurons in the prebuccia complex that are producing sighs have special receptors. These receptors are special molecules on neurons, in this case neurons, that when there's the presence of a particular molecule, in this case a particular peptide, when it binds to it, it induces a sigh. So we found that these physiological sighs are produced by a special family of peptides called bombesin-related peptides. And our colleagues at Stanford localized where these peptides might be coming in the brainstem. But we had also found, reading the literature, that when you're stressed, the hypothalamus, which is another part of your brain, releases these bombesin peptides. And that is the explanation as to why you sigh more when you're stressed, because the hypothalamus is releasing these peptides. Now, what do sighs do? Well, they pop open your alveoli, but in a way, they're these deep breaths that we know are act to calm you down. So when you're in situations where you're stressed, taking deep breaths, which are initiated by this hypothalamic release of these peptides, is going to bring you back towards a state which is a little less anxious, may not bring you all the way back, but will bring you back. And so that's part of the way we regulate our behavior, by inducing these sighs that in turn is going to cause our brain to feel less stressed. Now, as far as the organization of breathing, at rest, we're actively inspiring. That is, we contract our diaphragm, we lift up muscles in between our ribs that elevate our rib cage, and that's the inspiration. But at rest, we expire passively. That is, we just simply relax. And it's like pulling on a spring and letting go, pulling on a spring and letting go. And we, for a long time, thought that inspiration and expiration all came from one place. But it turns out that when you need to move more air, like when you exercise, there's another oscillator that is driving these expiratory movements. We call it active expiration. So when you begin to exercise, you go, and to force that air out, you're activating a different set of muscles, the muscles in your abdomen and the muscles in your rib cage that activate to close down or shrink your thorax. And that this is a separate oscillator. And the interesting thing is that this oscillator seems to be older in an evolutionary sense. When you look at amphibians and reptiles, they don't breathe by inspiring, they breathe by actively expiring and relaxing. But our evolution towards becoming mammals and warm-blooded required that we have these extremely complex lungs with a lot of surface area. These 400 million alveoli represent 70 square meters. It's about a third of the size of a tennis court that are in our lungs. So we have to stretch that and let it relax, stretch that and very relaxed. So in order to do that, we couldn't do that with expiration. We had to do that with inspiration. And so an important evolutionary change was the evolution of the diaphragm. And once we got a diaphragm, we now can move a lung that can move a lot of oxygen. We move a lot of oxygen, it means we can have an organ that needs a lot of oxygen, which is our brains. They use about 20% of our total oxygen intake, and we can remain warm-blooded. So all these things now are interacting and allowing us to maintain not only homeostasis, but this advanced function of having these big brains, which we use for all sorts of interesting things.
The evolution is fascinating in looking at that perspective in how the brain development and meeting the physiological demands, the metabolic demands of a growing human brain to recognize a key important piece here for everyone to take away is that at rest, humans, mammals, are active inspiratory breathers and passive expiratory breathers. When we start to get into physical activity, that's where those exhale pump muscles come online. So a characteristic within breathing practice is exhale pulsations or dynamic breath control, in that you're strengthening and building more coordination around how your expiratory breathing muscles operate. And really, we're keeping this open-ended in the sense that there isn't one right way to do a breathing practice, but to start exploring and experimenting with what feels good for you and recognizing where there may be a restriction in your breathing or where things break down, whether it's in a physical activity. So through taking 10 minutes a day to simply focus on a rhythmical breathing practice or doing exhale pulsations, that you start to tap into some of the deepest layers of your physiology that can truly leverage strength, endurance, balance within your nervous system, and be able to maximize your longevity and wellness.
Now, let me make another point, which is a little bit off your current topic, and that breathing is a behavior you do before you're born. So you have to be able to breathe at birth, and the nervous system has to make sure that it's wired properly, and you have to make sure that your lung is properly developed. So in the third trimester in utero, in all mammals, including humans, the fetus starts to generate sporadic respiratory movements. Now, there's no air to inhale in utero, but what it's doing is it's getting the muscles working because they're practicing. It's getting the circuits wired up so they're rhythmic, and it's getting the lung, so the lung is being stressed so that the lung develops properly. So here's to use the term stress, that to get the lung to develop properly, you got to stress it in utero. To get the diaphragm to develop properly, you got to stress it in utero. And nominally, you got to stress the nervous system to get it developed properly in utero. Because when you're born, you have to be able to breathe, you have to be able to suckle. And if you're a quadruped on the African savanna, you got to be able to walk within a few minutes of being born. Otherwise, some predator is going to eat you. So the nervous system is busy in utero getting ready for real behaviors, not just simply waiting until you develop ex utero, all these other different behaviors. Back to you, Sam.
Lots to explore. Well, so Jack, we had the opportunity to have you join our retreat this summer up in Topanga, and it was a pleasure to have you share with the group there and also explore some of the breathing practices that we were doing. Was there something that stood out within, as we've discussed, this multidisciplinary approach to breathing practice, not having one specific method or specific practice be what's in your toolkit, but having a versatility within how you respond to stimulus as you're moving through life, whether it's getting cut off in a car or preparing for a speech, getting into physical activity. And so within practices that we explored this summer, is there something that stood out to you in that multidisciplinary approach to the protocols, or anything that you're exploring in your own personal practice that you find to be effective as a best practice or key takeaway within inspiring others who are tuning in here about how they can start to explore breathing practice in their own way?
Well, I'm probably not going to answer that question directly, Sam, but what I will say is that one of my interests in going to your retreat was to meet your clients, the members of our Breath Collective, and get a sense from them, because I live in this academic silo and I don't really interact as much as I probably should with people outside the silo. And with respect to getting into breathing practice, I was really rather curious as to how these people felt about breathing practice. And the interest in part was they would have very few of the prejudices that I would have. And what impressed me was that they came from, if I can use the cliche, all walks of life, is how profoundly they felt the breathing practice affected them. And that had a lot of valence for me. I mean, I'm very curious to try and distinguish, what is actually working. And I'm not quite there yet. What works for me is a rather simple practice. So I basically do box breathing, which is inhale, hold, exhale, hold. This is something that is practiced by Navy SEALs under extremely stressful conditions. It's very simple. It's easy to tell someone how to do it. The more complex practices that more advanced yoga, Wim Hof, and so on do, I am sure have benefit, but I've not graduated to them yet. But I was impressed by the people who did follow these practices, how profoundly they felt it affected their life and perspective in important ways. I mean, it was really pretty impressive.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to have you there as well. And so outside of offline practice, we've also started to explore some other elements of breathing and delving into the chemistry of breath. We've had some candid conversations on the golf course about this, and some of one of your colleague and friends work, Gordon Mitchell. And I'd love to dive into exploring hypoxia, which is something that we can influence in some ways through practices like Wim Hof, minimal breathing techniques where you really slow down your breath and you're not taking in as much air. So naturally your body and metabolism use up the oxygen in your system, and you can breathe yourself in some ways into a hypoxic state. But with our Breath Collective, my friend and colleague Reese and I have been using a device and machine to induce ourselves into hypoxic states intermittently in this acute hypoxic practice. And the experience is very unique. I've been feeling quite euphoric when I do it, and also find myself feeling very energized and creative.
Sam, can I interrupt, because maybe we could back up a little bit and explain why this is of interest.
Absolutely.
Okay, so right now there's an incredible group at the University of Florida led by Gordon Mitchell, who is following up on observations that go back 20, 30 years, that if you give someone a low oxygen to breathe, their breathing will increase. Not surprising. And so if you give them 5 minutes of low oxygen, their breathing goes up. And if you take the oxygen and give them room air, again, their breathing comes back down to normal. So it goes up and down. That's pretty mundane. But it was discovered that if you expose someone, this is human subjects, to intermittent periods of this hypoxia, 3 minutes of hypoxia, 3 minutes normal air, 3 minutes hypoxia, 3 minutes normal air, and do it something like 5 times, what happens is breathing goes up, down, up, down, up, down. But after the last hypoxic episode, instead of going down, it rises and it stays up for hours. So there's something about the episodic hypoxia that changes the way you breathe for extended periods of time. Now, what's been amazing, and Gordon and his group have shown a lot of incredible data, is that this exposure to episodic hypoxia improves cognitive function, improves physical performance. They're testing it now for treatment of spinal cord injury and a whole host of ailments. That is, this may actually be something which has some therapeutic potential. So this is not something that's traditionally been seen within a breathing practice, but and I applaud Sam and Reese for exploring this, because as they take their insight in breathing practice and see whether or not exposure to episodic hypoxia has positive benefits, they can find ways to incorporate that for a wider audience. And it's clear that it's going to have benefits. I mean, it's pretty amazing. Sorry to have interrupted you.
No,
Sam,
it's been fascinating to explore. And I see one of Gordon Mitchell's colleagues, Mia, here with a comment: the pattern, frequency, levels of CO2 in addition to hypoxia, are essential components to the magnitude of neuroplasticity. I've found this to be interesting in reviewing those studies and papers around athletes who are looking to have more coordination, for example. The subjects who are having positive results with spinal cord injury, for example, to how we can create more somatic motor control plasticity in addition to respiratory motor plasticity, so more control of the diaphragm, and then from an athletic perspective to have more coordination and agility. The results there seem compelling.
I mean, it almost seems paradoxical, but here again, you're stressing the nervous system with hypoxia. So normally, oxygen that you inhale is 20% of the air. When you do these hypoxic episodes, you use oxygen that's maybe about 8% for a couple of minutes. It's not going to produce any long-lasting harm, but it's a challenge, it's a stress. The individual cells in your body are going to respond because they want to be in more optimal condition. And if you do this episodically, they have some long-term responses which seem to be beneficial for cellular function and global behavioral function. I mean, it is pretty amazing.
Everyone just take a sigh real quick. Breath and neuroscience. Science, the art and science of sighing.
Right, there you go.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to also just touch on a couple of like the practical aspects of breathing too. So I know you've mentioned a few times about how it can impact athletic performance and longevity. I don't know if you wanted to like talk to us about some of those specific techniques that someone can start to like implement into their toolbox as well.
Well, for those who are new to hearing about breathing practice, or who are interested in how they can integrate breathing practice into their life, it's something that can be quite simple in terms of creating space for 5 minutes to even observe your breathing and start to notice it. As you heard Jack speak to, breathing is an inherent and fundamental behavior. Think when you get surprised, there's a certain behavior that shows up. You get home and you get on the couch after a long day, and there's all of these different expressions that breath evokes within our state of being. And something in the work that I do and I share within breathing practice and our community where we lead guided sessions, our Breath Collective, that fundamentally through practice, we're building more self-awareness. You start to notice where you're holding tensions, how you're positioned, how you are breathing. So what I'll invite everybody to start doing through their day-to-day is just observing how their breath is happening. Are you breathing in and out through your nose? Do you have a tendency to breathe in and out through your mouth? Does it feel like the breath gets stuck up in your chest? Or are you able to allow your diaphragm to move robustly and maximize the volume of air and have this fluid sense of breath movement that's going through your body? This is all a direct link into your nervous system and thus your state of being. So when we're feeling like we're in chronic stress, that there's a potential that we're breathing in certain ways that are impacting that and driving ourselves into more of a sympathetic, stressful state. And so I don't have a set answer exactly for what is right for everybody, because something unique is also that one breathing practice will be more calming for me as it would be more energizing for you. And so the curiosity to start to play around with what feels good for your body and how it can serve your lifestyle is really where the discipline to start taking time each day to catch your breath behaviors as you move through the day, and also to take 5 minutes to sit down and just create a fluid flow of breath. Or I'm biased to invite you to join our live guided breathing session as well. Somebody here said, could you please explain more about how the hypoxia breathing should be?
Well, I can say that right now, when it's being studied in human subjects, it requires some specialized equipment, because to get 8% oxygen, you need some specialized equipment. I think it will be possible with breathing practice to get into a more hypoxic state, although I am not sure it can be extreme as 8% oxygen. So I think this is something which is being explored right now, is how it might be incorporated to people who don't have access to this kind of equipment.
Right, and surely mechanisms to explore, for example, in the Wim Hof Method breathing technique, you're taking 30 supraventilative breaths, so you're offloading a lot of carbon dioxide and going into a hypocapnic state, and then you go into a breath hold, and because CO2 levels are so low, you don't get the breathing stimulus, as carbon dioxide will be that alarm bell for you to take a breath. And in doing so, with this extended breath hold, you go into quite a hypoxic state, but as needs to be explored further, these interconnectedness between oxygen and carbon dioxide, as opposed to breathing normally through these. Hypoxico is a company that is producing these devices. I actually used it this morning before this session and was simulating being at the peak of Mount Denali, just sitting on the floor here. So it was about 9% oxygen, 21,000 feet.
Wow, that's really interesting. Well, it looks like we are kind of at time here, so I just want to thank you both so much for being here today and chatting about breath work and the science behind breath work and some of those practical aspects of it as well. So thank you both so much. And to anyone who is looking to look at the replay, we'll have that up on our YouTube channel within the next week. And if anyone here is also interested in trying out InsideTracker, we are offering 25% off all plans with the code breathwork.
Well, thanks very much. It's been a privilege to be here today and to talk to everyone who has tuned in. I think that this has breathwork has tremendous potential for everyone to improve their health, regardless of anything else that they're doing. So I would encourage people to look into it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jack, for all your work and all that you do to help make this accessible to the world. That's surely one of my missions, is to spread the awareness and education and make this accessible to everybody, and to InsideTracker. And thank you, Michelle, for putting this together and hosting us. Final takeaway for everybody to consider: you take 600 million to 1 billion breaths in your lifetime. And we can get so tethered to the future with this capacity in our human brains, and we can get attached to our past. There's one thing that's happening right now, and it's your breathing. So anytime you're feeling anxious about something that's to come, or you feel depressed about something that happened that you're holding on to from a past experience, the breath is always here for you. It's your best friend. And it's a beautiful way to always bring yourself back to the moment, because it is one of the only things that is happening right now. And to consider that you have this bank of breath, or this battery of breaths, 600 million to 1 billion breaths, and that we could savor each one, maybe to find more appreciation for the life that we have, and to move through it more gracefully and with appreciation for the inspiration that is so extraordinary and complex, yet so simple. So I'm constantly fascinated by that, and you've been quite an inspiration to me, Jack, and I'm so grateful for all that you do.
Well, that's great. And once again, thanks to InsideTracker and Michelle for this opportunity to present our stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that with all of these audiences. I think that's really powerful and something that people can, like you said, it's like it's a low cost, it's low risk, and it can be really beneficial. So yeah, thank you both.
Absolutely. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out. Always love hearing from people about what's working with their practice. I welcome you to check out what we're doing with our Breath Collective. You can check out their Instagram page or ourbreathcollective.com. And really a beautiful piece. We can all practice on our own. And then when coming together in a community, having that support and breathing together in person or online, there's this sense of connection that you experience that really goes beyond words. And that's something that I love about what we're doing with community, and building community together through science and with InsideTracker. So the opportunity to collaborate is deeply respected and appreciated.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you again.
Excellent.
Ciao.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. All the
Thank
best.
you. Bye now.